Right, March the 10th, 7:23 Central Daylight Savings Time. This is for the beginner and intermediate level squirrel hunters. I think I can classify myself as an advanced squirrel hunter. It's not saying much. Okay. Knowing the trajectory of your round is important in the squirrel woods. Squirrels can be around twigs and sticks, leaves, bushes, and in particular using a scoped rifle, be it a firearm or an air rifle. Your scope center above the center of the bore is something to be mindful of. Now, there's some people out there run some really high scopes and some not so high. I generally prefer to run a lower scope, okay, but you don't have to. I've got an air rifle set up made by FX. The scope center above center of bore is 2.87 inches. All right. You can go look at things like Cherry Gun, Stray Lock. Element Optics has a good app you can download for free. But you're going to need to know some information about the round you're shooting. Its speed at the muzzle and its ballistic coefficient. You can find this data generally, okay? So what does all this mean when you're in the squirrel woods? I'm just going to use my example of my air gun. Now, remember, the ballistic coefficient and the speed is going to drive how your bullet lines up with a line of sight. So your bullet never lines up with a line of sight ever, all the time. But it can at times. And you need to know that because that's how you're going to be making points of impact. Okay? So my gun is 2.87 inches, scope center above center of bore. And shooting these slugs, and I'm just going to use these slugs, I'm shooting these JSB knockout slugs. It's coming up on the line of sight at about 26 yards and it breaks back over at 50. With a 50-yard zero. Now, when you're in the squirrel woods using scopes, here's a good tip. The naked eye view of a squirrel is very important. Okay? Why is that? Because if you're shooting at a squirrel, for example, at 50 yards, and let's say you're using a scope, a 10-power scope, and it's got parallax adjustment on it. And you've got your parallax adjusted for that squirrel you're seeing in them woods at 60 yards, or 50 yards, I'm sorry, 50 yards. If you just look through that scope at that squirrel, there's a chance you may not see a twig that's in your way because it's out of focus. So look first, the naked eye view, and what that's going to do is that's going to expose some smaller twigs, and what you have to be watching for is twigs that are beneath your line of sight, especially those close. Example, on my air gun, the way it's set up, if I see a small twig or group of twigs 2 inches below my line of sight, they're real close to me, well, what does that mean? That means when I sight that squirrel, my slug is going to hit those twigs. So you have to look beneath your actual line of sight at the the closer twigs to you. All right? So knowing your trajectory and how it matches up with your line of sight, looking through your scope versus the path the bullet takes leaving the end of the barrel. Okay, now here's something else you have to think about. Let's say you're shooting. Now remember, a pellet is generally going to shoot loopier than a slug. Or a .22 long rifle is going to shoot loopier than a 17 HMR or a 17 HM2. So what this means, there will be distances where you could actually see a twig or a small thin limb in your line of sight. But let's say it's out there at like 30 yards. Well, your gun may shoot loopy enough where you can actually have your scope on that twig. And you can see the squirrel behind it because the squirrel is a bigger critter. But when you touch the trigger on your air rifle or your rimfire rifle, for example, you're not even going to hit it because the bullet's going to go over it. See, so all this is nice to know. And you get in these squirrel woods, and a lot of times when the squirrel starts grouping up, they generally group up where it's thick. They don't like it clean, okay? Especially when that sun is bright. And them old fox squirrels, they really know how to get in them twigs. You'll hear me talking a lot of my videos about obstructions, okay? I'm always watching for obstructions. Now, sometimes I take a chance. A lot of times I don't. Okay? So like I said, you know, back in the old days when I started hunting, you know, we didn't have computers. You learned a lot of this shit through trial and error, okay? But looking at these different programs, like I mentioned earlier in this video, with your zero set on your gun and your scope height, your speed, and your ballistic coefficient, it's going to tell you, it's going to show you the rainbow of the shot and how that bullet path interacts with your actual line of sight. And when you're in the wild, you have to be always looking at this. And be on guard. Because truthfully, you know, the fewer times you shoot a gun, the better in the woods. Meaning you won't, you know, if you shoot the gun, you want to harvest the critter. You don't want to be shooting up there hitting twigs and scaring one squirrel and there's 5 more with him because they'll all get the message and they'll haul, you know what. Okay. There's some information on the internet where it gives some pictorials. It will sort of describe what I'm showing. Just remember now, the different calibers and rounds out there, the different speeds are different. Okay? So it's what you're using at the time in the woods that matters. And there are, like I said, you know, there are some workarounds, meaning there are sometimes when you have something in your actual line of sight and it doesn't matter. Okay? Anyway, that's going to conclude the video. We may try to get out today and bust a few squirrels with that air rifle again.